Good morning and welcome to the Point. It has been just more than 3 weeks since Donald Trump became President Trump, and his administration has already started to reshape the look of Washington, D.C. Joining us now is one of the people that's seen it up close and personal, Congressman Bill Huizenga. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Rick. Good to be with you.
It has been a busy 3 weeks for you and particularly for your counterparts in the Senate, where they've been trying at a pretty slow pace compared to recent administrations. Get some cabinet appointees, and we're going to talk about all that. But let's just start with the way President Trump has approached this so far from your perspective.
Yeah.
You were certainly there for President Obama. You were a staffer when President Clinton was in office, I think, and certainly when George W. Bush was. So you've seen this up close and personal. How's it different this time?
Well, so one difference, and if anybody's heard any of my interviews previously, they know one of my criticism of the Obama administration had been a lack of relationships, a lack of reaching out. And that is something that we've seen immediately, partially because of Mike Pence and his presence. He not only has taken an office over on the Senate side, traditionally as president of the Senate, he would normally do. He's actually also taken an office over on the House side. And they are, well, because he's somebody who came into the House, and he understands the legislative process, and he's really been the major go-between between the administration and the legislature so far. So there is no doubt that Donald Trump does not lack for clarity of his vision of the direction he wants to go. Do I wish there was a different tone at times and a different way of handling it? Absolutely. But many of the things that he is doing should not be a surprise to anybody who voted either for him or against him.
Well, there is a certain amount of following through, and some of that follow through, it seems that, from my perspective, and certainly not suggesting this is your view, but my view is that he said he was going to do this, 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 this. I was at a lot of the rallies, and he said on day one we're going to do this, to which you say, well, you can't do it on day one because you as a president of the United States can't undo legislation, for example, the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare. But it seems that he has gone after that with the idea that I will at least get all of this started. Would he have been better served to take a step back, send out Vice President Pence to talk to you and maybe the caucus and say, this is what we're going to do on Tuesday, and then next Wednesday we're going to do this, rather than just kind of get the fire hose out?
Well, you know, I don't believe that what he has done, absent the executive order on the immigration, that has probably been the roughest rollout. It was a horrible rollout. There was no rollout.
Right.
Other than that, though, I mean, these are things that he said that he would do. He has gone as far as he can go with the executive order side of things. They have been working closely with us as in the legislature, saying, okay, we need you now to step in. In fact, I have a bill that passed the House and the Senate and is headed to the president's desk, and anticipate on Tuesday he's going to be signing that. So we've already seen a legislative agenda move as well. The big issues, as you point out, we didn't get into these issues or into these problems overnight, like with Obamacare or our tax policy. We're not going to get out of them overnight either. And I think some of that is just the realities of how a legislative body and a representative republic works.
And part of it could be the difference from being a CEO who says, do this, do it now, to being 1/3 of the part of government that gets to say, I think we should do this, can you go along with it?
Yeah, and that's always that healthy tension that goes back to the very early days of the founding, and you know we've always had a healthy tension. I think it's gotten out of whack at various times. Clearly, we saw the last administration come in and say, well, it doesn't matter what you want to do, legislature, I'm going to go around you. I've got my phone, I've got my pen, I've got my executive order, I've got my executive actions, I've got all these other sort of extra constitutional paths that the Obama administration had tried to do. I for one, believe that no matter who the president is, they need to be within the Constitution. We need to make sure that we have our legislative stamp on those things. There are some things that very clearly are within the purview of the executive, no matter who he or she eventually that person will be, but there are things that are clearly within the purview of the legislature as well.
Let's talk about cabinet, because this process has been slower than for any of the previous presidents that I recall. Unless I'm mistaken, I think President Obama had 14 of his 15 cabinet members in place by this point in his first term. I think President George W. Bush had all 14 because he added one. Homeland Security was added after the fact. And I think even though there was a lot of tension there, as we all remember, that was
the 2000 election.
There was no honeymoon there, but so those were all there. Is this because, from your perspective, that this president has selected cabinet members that are objectionable, or are some members over in the Senate still just fighting back because of what was a shock for many in the outcome of this election?
I think it was more of the latter. I really do. President Trump obviously has gotten some different profiles into those cabinet positions, but nonetheless, I mean, there is no reason to hold up a Mick Mulvaney, for example. And Mick Mulvaney is going to head up a very important but somewhat small element of what we have when it comes to putting our budgets together and all those things. They're working on a budget. He will be the first person that hasn't been put in place within 2 weeks in the modern era since that position has existed. You know, it's those kinds of things that lead you to believe that it's just holdover residual bitterness over the outcome of the election, not the election and the election process, as you point out in 2000. That was a pretty bitter fight. But at the end of the day, people decided that they needed and wanted government to work. We now have some groups, both inside and outside the legislative process, that are deciding that they don't want government to work. And that's something that was interesting to me, that I had spent 6 years getting lectured to about how I needed to show respect for the process, respect for the person holding the office, make sure that government was functioning. And for the most part, that's exactly what I did. And I got kudos from a lot of those same people who are now turning around saying, no, this is different. And I don't think it is different.
There was, to be fair, pushback from Republicans when President Obama was elected.
Mm-hmm.
Some Republicans said our job is to make sure he doesn't get anything done. So there was some of this.
Sure. They did not hold up cabinet positions like that, as you point out, how quickly those were done. We had a government shutdown. That was probably the culmination of that. And after that, many people like myself looked at it and said, okay, to what end and to what purpose? It didn't achieve the goals that were stated by some in the Senate and other places. So at the end of the day, the question I think we all collectively have to wrestle with here is, are we going to allow ourselves to be governed? And for some, that answer is no. That's sad. That is obviously makes the job much more difficult. But then, how in the world, if we're not going to govern, then what are we going to do when it comes picket, from paying our troops to making sure that we've got border security, to making sure that we got health care, making sure that we have an infrastructure? Those are essential functions of government.
How does this work? And I've gone through this time and time again. We've got about 3 minutes left in this segment. How does it work if in the House, where you have voted to repeal the Affordable Care Act dozens of times already?
Yep. Either in whole or in part.
Right.
Yep.
So I make the assumption you can do that again. You still have to have 60 votes over on the other side, won't you?
Yes. At some point or another, there will be certain parts, and not to get too far into the weeds, but reconciliation, which was the funding mechanism of Obamacare, happened after Ted Kennedy died. After Scott Brown, that became a national election that then became a 59-41 majority for the Democrats rather than a 60-40, when they could do literally whatever they wanted to do, and they did. Dodd-Frank, the Affordable Care Act, and Obamacare, and that changed the dynamic. So at that point, then they decided, hey, the only way for us to follow through on this is with simple majority. Well, we're going to be able to go back in and deal with those things that were passed with simple majority. But to really repair our healthcare system, which is the key here, Rick. Going back to what we had prior to Obamacare is not success, but neither is Obamacare. It is imploding on itself. It is a slow motion train wreck. And my question that I would put to those who are critical of my position, what's your plan? Well, it took 14 months to put this into place. It's going to take some while coming out of it. I would turn the question back on them and say, what is your plan as this system is failing? And they have none. So we definitely are going to continue to struggle with these issues. It's not going to be overnight, but we've got to move forward and figure out what we're going to do. I think that the roadmap that the Republicans laid out in our Better Way program, our plan prior to the election, is a good start. But we are going to have to work with the Senate, who's going to have to find a way on certain parts of it to get to 60 votes.
There are 535 of you that have to come to a majority agreement, and in the Senate, you say you have to get 60. So when you say it took 14 months to roll this all out or put it all together in the first place, and it was done with all Democratic votes,
Yep.
In the initial sense, finding a bipartisan solution in what seems to me to be a supercharged environment, pretty hyperbolic, a lot of rhetoric going on. Seems like that is a big, really tall order.
It's going to be big. It's going to be very difficult. I think it's going to take some real effort on the part of the White House, both President Trump, Vice President Pence, coming in, talking to those Democrats who are open and want to be reasonable and want to have government function. Joe Manchin has voted for some of the cabinet appointments, for example, and voted against some others. Very thoughtful about that. There are a number of other senators that are going to be thoughtful about it as well, versus being reactionary. And whether you're reactionary on my side of the aisle or reactionary on the other side of the aisle, just with your answer is no, I don't think that's productive for the country.
There's a lot more we want to talk about because there are some things happening. For example, legislation that you were talking about a moment ago. You have a new assignment in this Congress, and it's something that people may not be fully aware of, but once you talk about it, I think they will find it interesting. And as always, Great Lakes is something that you're interested in too. So when we come back, we're going to talk about all of those things, but we're also going to catch up on one more nomination. We'll do all that when we come back to the point. Welcome back to the Point. Our guest is Congressman Bill Huizenga from the Lakeshore. Bill, let's talk for just a minute about where we are in terms of the next steps. The cabinet is starting to come together. For example, let me ask you about this. Betsy DeVos, someone who you know quite well here from West Michigan, was approved in a historic way to some degree with the Vice President casting that deciding vote. Since then, there have been further dust-ups. There were protesters at a school that she tried to visit in Washington, D.C. What does that do for that department? How does she now come back and work with the 50 members in the Senate that voted against it?
Well, as we were saying in the previous segment, there are some who voted for and against cabinet members who have been thoughtful and have said, you know what, I had to express my opinion, but now that you're in, let's go make this work. Interestingly enough, AFT, American Federation of Teachers, the head of that union tweeted out, "We want Betsy coming to these public schools. Don't protest it. Don't block her from going in. That doesn't make any sense." So you'll have senators like that and House members who have been critical, who said, "Okay, the people that are going to be in government here now for the next 4 years are in place. Let's go make this work as best we can." You have others that are just simply going to say, I will have nothing to do with it, and I will put every roadblock up that I possibly can. And if that means kids pay a price, so be it. If that means public schools, private schools, charter schools, education as a whole in the United States, that pays a price, so be it. This is civil war, and we're going to let the chips fall where they may. That is just amazingly short-sighted and just, I think, so selfish, frankly, that they ought to be ashamed of themselves.
One other thing about education, and it came from, in my mind, it was something that I wasn't expecting. There was a bill that was introduced by one of your colleagues that said abolish the Department of Education. I don't want to get too far down the road on that. Are those kind of things serious?
It's a little close to home here.
Well, are those Justin Amash, congressman from here in the area, also supported that bill. Are those kind of things proposals that they really intend to pursue, or are those statements?
Well, they certainly aren't new statements. Those are bills that have been put out at various degrees. I mean, that's been a discussion back when Pete Hoekstra was on the Education and Workforce Committee. The question is what is going to be the priority moving forward of the president? And that's, again, where the constitutional, legislative, and executive balance happens. We can say whatever we want to do in the House, 50% plus one, and you can go do whatever you want to do. Often, most of the time, you need to hit 60 votes or 60% in the Senate. And guess what? There's one vote at the end of Pennsylvania Avenue. And I say it's the most exclusive zip code in the country. 218-61.
Right.
And you've got to put all of those elements together to get real legislative changes. So there's still going to be people out there on both sides of the aisle that are trying to make a statement, trying to push the conversation and the direction. Certainly, that's not new. You need to have a conversation like that nationally to sometimes move beyond just the reactionary or the knee-jerk.
The other thing that we should always keep in mind, once again, things do not move quickly in Washington. So we're at the beginning of a brand new legislative session. And so anything that you hear talked about now is way in the offing, and those discussions will be long and arduous. And you got to keep in mind 60.
You do. And when my dad came out of the Army and went to Calvin College, he became a history teacher for a period of time. And I have a love of history. And you look at the history of our country. It was not designed to be efficient. It was not designed to necessarily be easy. And we've slid away from that, frankly. There's been an erosion of the power of the legislature. It's gone to the courts and it's gone into the executive. And it's our job, and that's something why I think you've seen the Republicans try to really pull back, even in the Trump administration, to make sure that our proper constitutional role is being fulfilled.
Well, to the degree that it was designed not to be efficient, it's working well in very many ways.
True.
Let's talk about some things that are happening. Talk to me about the Capital Markets Subcommittee, which you now chair, and many people, I would think, are probably unaware that it exists, but it has big impact on financial markets and consequently could have impact on their bottom line.
And their bottom line literally through every investment that they make, whether it's in a publicly held company, whether it's in a mutual fund. The capital markets, it's Capital Markets, Securities and Investment Subcommittee of the Financial Services Committee. It's the largest of the subcommittees. The main sort of oversight that it has is on the Securities and Exchange Commission. Securities and Exchange Commission literally touches every publicly traded company in the United States. All of the stock exchanges, there's 20 of them here, internationally, how we interact with other economies. All of the corporate governance flows through that. All of the various accounting firms, all of the rules that they dictate and that they operate by. So it's a very, very large subcommittee, very broad, and it's been fascinating. I've served on it now for a couple of terms, and the chair had lost in this last election, and I was elevated and jumped a few folks to be able to go do that. So I'm quite honored to be able to have that position, because it literally touches everything that we as citizens here in this country deal with financially.
You've already started taking on some regulations and some thoughts about what might be entailed in part of this. Talk to me about some legislation that you've already passed.
We passed a House Joint Resolution, it was House Joint Resolution 41, that was dealing with a Securities and Exchange rule regarding extractive minerals. That's gas, minerals, oil that had been part of the Dodd-Frank Act. And there had been a lawsuit once the SEC had put a rule in place. Courts threw out the rule. They then got sued in turn. SEC got sued in turn by Oxfam and a few others, saying, no, we need a rule. So the SEC last June basically put the same rule back in place with, they kind of trimmed the edges a little bit, and that was about it. And this rule is going to lose again in court. And so what our resolution said is okay, we're going to eliminate that rule through the Congressional Review Act. That gives us a 6-month look back to say, okay, non-legislative rules that are being passed by departments, we have the opportunity to go back in and say this makes sense or this doesn't make sense. What my resolution does is it removes that rule and says, okay, SEC, go at it again. It doesn't change the law of Dodd-Frank yet. It just literally says, SEC, you got to give a different rule than what the one that is lost in court.
When you talk about Dodd-Frank, very much like we talked about doing away with the Department of Education, a whole lot of your colleagues have said we got to do away with Dodd-Frank. Dodd-Frank is a bad thing. There are a lot of rules, regulations that keep financial institutions, borrowers, lenders. It dries up capital of small business, all of the different arguments against it. But it was written for a reason at a time when people were concerned about banking regulations. Is it something that needs to be done away with or something that needs to be refined?
Yeah, I much like Obamacare, I don't think it can be rescued. I don't think it can be repaired. And so we need to start over. Because, Rick, we have an alphabet soup of regulators that already existed. And somehow or another, people are trying to spin this like they're all going to disappear. That simply isn't the case. What it has done, though, is it has made banking, and I'm not concerned about the bankers, I'm concerned about their customers. And what it has done is it has basically made banking impossible for the small community bank. We are seeing a community bank a day go out of business. A community bank a day go out of business. What it has done is it has made the big banks even bigger. They've consolidated their power. It is too big to fail has not gone away under Dodd-Frank. And we've got just this myriad of rules that oftentimes are conflicting with each other. And you've got bureaucrats kind of looking at each other going, you need to follow our rule. Well, the next alphabet soup regulator says, no, you need to follow our rule. And unfortunately, you have people, whether it's in banking or insurance or in business, all looking at each other going, we don't know what to do. And their compliance officers, their CPAs and their lawyers are all telling them, you have to follow all the rules. But following all the rules is impossible. So we have to go through and figure out and sort through what are the regulations that are really working, what are the ones that frankly are just window dressing, that aren't really doing anything, but make people feel better because they somehow passed a law. Well, I'm not into feel-good legislation. I'm into real results, and I think that's what we need to do. And to do that, we need to get rid of Dodd-Frank. We have that through the Choice Act. It's a bill that's very comprehensive. I have some big pieces of that. Fed reform is part of that. Fed reform, Fed Oversight Reform and Modernization Act. The FORM Act was rolled into that. Deals with the Federal Reserve. Mergers and acquisitions, something that I've been working on, trying to make sure that those small family-owned, privately held companies are going to be able to stay in our communities. Those are real jobs, and we need to fight for those.
There's much more to talk about this, and I hope you'll come back maybe in the second quarter when things start to roll, and we'll see how far along we get there. I apologize for not getting to the Great Lakes Task Force, something I know that you're passionate about, and something I know people in our viewing areas, but we'll have the opportunity to have you come back and talk about this. I want to thank you for coming in on what has been a very busy first 3 weeks of this administration. And I guess we're going to have a lot more of these conversations because it appears to me that what's happening in Washington now is something we haven't seen.
Yep, and we've got a full slate here coming for the next few weeks as well. So looking forward to it.
Congressman Bill Huizenga, thank you very much, and thank you. Stick around. We've got more to the point in just a moment. So, just over 3 weeks into a new administration, Washington is still an unsettled environment. We'll continue to watch what goes on there and bring you a different perspective of that new Trump administration next week. Plus, we'll be following the latest of the legislature in Lansing that's getting underway with a new agenda. All that and more next week when you join us right here, 10 o'clock on Wood TV 8 for To The Point.